Now, what good does it do you to spend all year investing your blood, sweat, and tears to put yourself in position to get a chance at a good buck, only to blow it in the moment of truth? In this video, I'm gonna get super vulnerable and share 3 situations where I absolutely blew it, so hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. Each example is a specific hunt from this last season where I did everything right, almost. And the mistakes that I made cost me punching tags on multiple good bucks. Learn from my mistakes so you don't end up tripping over the same sticks that I did. At the end, I'll also share one of my best tips for combating these mistakes, so make sure you stick around till the end. The first hunt was during mid-October in Pennsylvania. After observing several bucks come into an overgrown field the previous night, I made the adjustment using my tree saddle and put myself within bow range of that trail. There were 2 bucks that I was interested in. One was a 3-year-old 10-point and the other was a tall 8. The tall 8 was my #1 target after seeing him the night before. The wind was marginal, but I knew that if I wanted to get a crack at one of these bucks, that is where I had to be. Everything was going perfectly, and as the sun began to set, that 10-point came out at my 2 o'clock. I would have been stoked to wrap my tag around his antlers, so I began to get set for the shot. As I was ranging him well within shooting distance, the big 8, my preferred target, entered the field on the other side of me. I disengaged from the 10 and went into kill mode. The 8-point stopped broadside, feeding on clover, unalert at 30 yards on the dot. I drew, settled into my shot, released, and shot right over his back. In the moment, I assumed my form was a little wonky and somehow that threw the flight of my arrow off, but once I sat down to edit the video from this hunt, I was able to slow things down and realize that the buck ducked my arrow. The big mistake that I made was aiming where I did instead of aiming low. Since the buck was on alert, I didn't even consider the fact that he could drop as fast as he did. After doing more research on this topic, the physics makes a lot of sense. When a deer has its head down, it's able to drop much faster than when its head is up. It's like a sprinter pumping his fist to propel himself to run faster. By throwing his head up, he was able to drop in a fraction of a second. So in hindsight, I would have aimed for the lower part of his heart. If he didn't drop, I would have hit him in the heart, and if he did drop, I'd have at least caught his lungs. Or the other option could have been just to wait until he picked his head up to look around, but in this situation, I probably would have just aimed a bit lower in case he did feed out of range with his head down the entire time. Let me know what you would have done down below in the comments and we can compile all of the best advice. Now, the second hunt was on November 12th, and to give you a little context, at this point in the season, I had already hunted in 4 different states starting at the beginning of September without punching a tag. This would have been my 10th or 11th all-day sit for the season, and I was getting pretty discouraged, but knew that if I just kept grinding, eventually I'd get my chance. So after having some doe action and a 2.5-year-old buck earlier in the morning, I was settled in, prepared to sit tight till dark. At about 12:45 in the afternoon, I caught a glimpse of a buck walking through a thicket where some other deer had been bedded earlier in the day. It was a buck that we had several trail cam pictures of and guessed him to be a 3.5-year-old, which is a good buck in Michigan. He was hustling towards me, aiming right for the fence gap that I'd set up over. He was going to be at 20 yards, which is a chip shot in most cases. He was on a mission, and it took multiple attempts to get him to stop. I settled my pin just as he started to walk again, and instead of stopping him a second time, I tried to compensate for his movement and release my arrow. It hit him back and ended up being a straight liver hit. Instead of watching him go down within sight and celebrating from the tree, I knew I'd have a long day and possibly a long night ahead of me while I let him lay. I ended up leaving him overnight and recovered him the morning after. If I could have done this all over again, I would have made sure that the buck was completely stopped again before sending an arrow his way. The ultimate outcome might not have changed, but it would have been a much more humane kill, which is the top goal, and I would have got to skip the roller coaster of emotions that unfortunately happens in bow hunting. The third and final hunt was just a handful of days after I harvested my first Michigan buck. A nice 8-point locked down with a doe in a cut bean field. The next day, he was bedded with her again in the same area in a cut corn field. Over the last few years, I learned that when bucks are locked down, they are extremely vulnerable and they are very responsive to decoys. I figured that if I could slip into the general area and get close enough for him to feel threatened, he would march right in and I could get a shot at him. Essentially, I was able to pull off exactly that. While the buck was up on his feet chasing off a younger buck, I used a little bit of elevation change to my advantage and slipped around them and set up my decoy. I had no idea if this was going to work or not, but about an hour later, the buck and doe materialized right on top of the rise. After unsuccessfully rattling and grunting at him multiple times over the course of the afternoon, eventually they started feeding towards me once it got closer to dusk. I stayed frozen and they approached the decoy until eventually the buck postured up and marched in for a fight. It was at this moment that I decided it was now or never to get my bow up and draw. Big mistake. Both the buck and the doe spotted the movement and locked up. The doe took off and I ripped my bow back, knowing it was a matter of seconds until the buck followed suit. I settled in, and just as he began to bolt, I took a shot out of desperation. Luckily, I missed him clean. After thinking outside of the box, executing this ultra aggressive move and getting so close, I was so determined to close the deal and launched an ill-advised arrow at this buck. I instantly regretted shooting the arrow and kicked myself because I definitely know better than to take a shot that stupid. I was so proud that I made the decisions leading up to this moment that put me in position to have the encounter, but I should have known better, and I share this story with you because I know I'm not the only one that's blacked out in the moment of truth and taken a shot that they wish they could have back. Luckily for me, I missed clean and didn't win this beautiful buck. This situation had several mistakes. It took the buck and a doe a long time to eventually get to the decoy, and they were facing me the entire time. In hindsight, I should have had my bow up way earlier, and that way maybe I could have got drawn back without him catching my movement. I would have also set up my decoy a bit further away, but I was concerned with how noisy the dry, crunchy corn husks were on the ground. Ultimately, since things played out the way that they did, I should have never taken the shot, and I hope that my error in judgment causes some of you to think through situations like this before they actually happen. Now, after sharing the 3 hunts, you could probably come to the conclusion that I'm an idiot, and that might be fair, but I point out my mistakes in hopes to help you avoid similar situations in the future. One of the best tips that I would give newer hunters or people struggling with situations like this, and something I plan to do a lot more of next year, is to shoot does. You could hunt hard all season long and get 1, maybe 2 opportunities at a buck that you deem worthy of shooting. This results in low reps when it counts, and you don't get to exercise that muscle of making good decisions when it's game time. By hunting does, regardless of what time of the season, you're gonna get a lot more reps executing your shot on a live animal, and it's gonna make you that much more lethal when you finally get an opportunity at a good buck. This also gives you more opportunities to practice tracking deer and doing some of the after shot activities, which are very valuable skills. I've gotten away from shooting does the last 3 or 4 seasons, and it shows based off of all of my F-ups. Hopefully this helps some of you out. Don't judge me too hard for pointing out my downfalls, but thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.